Hello and welcome to this panel session, Going Its Own Way or Changing Its Tune? What's next for India when it comes to free trade? My name's Eleanor Wragg and I'm a senior reporter at GTR. Joining me for today's conversation are three fantastic subject matter experts who I'm delighted to introduce. We have Deborah Elms, Executive Director of the Asian Trade Centre, Manab Majumdar, Deputy Secretary General at the Federation of Indian Chambers of Commerce and Industry, and Rajiv Biswas, Asia Pacific Chief Economist at IHS Markit. Thank you to all of you for joining us today. Now, after 8 long years of negotiations, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, or RCEP, which is a free trade agreement covering almost a third of the world's population and 30% of GDP, became a reality at the end of last year. The deal was concluded between China, the 10 ASEAN member states, Australia, New Zealand, Japan, and South Korea. Now, India, which had been a participant in the talks, left the trade pact in November 2019. Therefore, RCEP's gone ahead without India. Rajiv, if I start with you, I'd like to get from you what the main motivations were behind this decision by India, and to what extent have its concerns played out in the months that have followed the agreement?
I think India faced a lot of domestic concerns about the potential impact of trade liberalization through RCEP, particularly because it would have implied significant trade liberalization and lowering of trade barriers in India. And India hadn't been in the same kind of stage of trade liberalization as some of the other countries that were signatories, such as if we take, for example, some of the ASEAN countries, which have been more advanced in their trade liberalization because they're members of the ASEAN Free Trade Area, they'd already made a lot of progress in lowering trade barriers. And similarly, Australia and New Zealand had also in previous years made a lot of progress, whereas India was probably not at that stage. And there was a lot of backlash from interest groups, from various segments of industry, about the potential impact that lowering these trade barriers would have on Indian industry, and also particularly in the manufacturing sector, that this could result in a deteriorating trade imbalance, with India already having competitive issues in manufacturing. And so I think, therefore, there was a lot of political pressure on the government to back away from this. And I think also in the context of the negotiations, because India had been facing a lot of domestic challenges and had a lot of concerns also about the details of the negotiations, I think India had become something of a roadblock to the progress of RCEP. So I think probably in the interests of the broader grouping of RCEP, it was also probably helpful that India did decide that it would stand to one side, at least for the moment, and allow the other members to proceed with the deal, which they have, of course, now done. It's now in the ratification stage. So I think there was a lot of issues that pushed India into that situation where it, although I think strategically it would have very much liked to be part of RCEP, in the end it decided that the timing wasn't really right and appropriate for them to proceed.
Fantastic. And I think what's interesting, you mentioned there about the industry groups and some of the interest groups who were sort of, concerned about the impact of the proposed deal. So Manab, as the representative here of those groups, of several of those groups, what was the sentiment from the Indian business community? What were their concerns?
Okay, thanks. Before I begin my comments, I must share with you that how delighted I am to be in this forum with my co-panelists. Thank you for the invitation. Now, moving on to the subject and the topic. See, the trade in industry from India, the domestic constituent, some of the points have already been touched upon, though briefly, by Rajiv. But there were several concerns. I'll just, in the interest of time, I'll limit to 3 or 4. Indian industry have realized over the years with its experience with other FTAs, and please remember that several FTAs were with some constituent countries of the RCEP. India's experience has been, if I may put it mildly, was not so encouraging, because Indian industry found that as a result of these FTAs, India's exports have not really gone up the way it should have. On the other hand, imports have sort of flooded across several important products. But coming back to RCEP, in the background of this kind of not so encouraging experience, there were at least 3 concerns which sort of came to the fore during various consultations and sensitization meeting. One was that threats of circumvention of rules of origin, ROO, due to tariff differential, that has not been adequately addressed in the then existing draft of the RCEP when it was under negotiation during late 2019. Then also there was not enough indication of opening up of services where India has got distinct competitive advantages in the text, then existing text, that is, reflecting India's competitive advantage adequately and reflecting the greater opening or the desired optimum opening for India's professionals and service providers. There are other concerns, including the absence of special safeguard mechanism, which probably would have been a sort of defensive, adequate defensive and legitimate defensive mechanism in the event of any unfair rush or flood of imports following the agreement. So these are some areas of concerns where Indian industry by and large felt there were inadequate protections against likely surge in imports following RCEP, or to counter the negative repercussions of our agreement which is in the offing called RCEP. And I have to share with you, this was not limited to 1 or 2 sectors or subsectors. It was quite evident from sector to sector, subsector to subsector, ranging from auto, pharma, then IT, your chemicals, dairy, plantation crops, everything. So these are the sort of, I think it would be a sample of the sentiment and that sort of sentiment which prevailed during the period in the run-up to RCEP talks, and when till the point we were negotiating it, India was in the negotiating table.
Thank you. It's very interesting to hear that perspective. And one of the points you raised was about this concern about sort of, the flood of imports, particularly, I suppose, from China. And that seemed to have been, and Deborah, I'll sort of hand this over to you because you know a lot more about this than I do, but I heard that a lot from various policymakers. One of their concerns was around the nation's complicated relationship with China, and the imports part of it was just one aspect. In your view, how does this mesh with Japan and Australia's decision to go ahead with the RCEP despite their own ongoing tensions with China? How does this all sort of work out?
Well, Asia is a complicated place. And so when you try to get 16 countries, ranging from enormous countries to tiny ones, landlocked, seafaring, every kind of language from rich to poor, trying to get 16 very diverse countries together has been and was and will remain a challenge, because there's just so many issues that they have with each other. They have issues between North and South and East and everything. So trying to solve the RCEP puzzle was difficult, and trying to figure out how do you deal with competitiveness challenges was difficult for everyone. Now the nature of those competitiveness challenges varies, of course, but depending on which country we're talking about. But if we're talking about political obstacles or security tensions, those were high from lots of countries during the negotiations. And at one point, for example, South Korea and Japan could not be in the same room together outside of RCEP. So there was a whole not going to sit next to each other. But in RCEP, because of the alphabetical seating, it was Japan and Korea right next to each other. Or you may recall, we've had some growing tensions between Australia and China. But again, because of the nature of seating, Australia sat next to China for 8 years of RCEP negotiations. So these kinds of concerns are not unique to India. Concerns about political issues, security tensions, and then of course trade obstacles or potential competitiveness obstacles is not small. But I think what you can see is difficulties across the landscape here trying to deal with how do we address these challenges. And India in that sense is not unique. But what is different is that India's solution to these competitiveness challenges was to exit the talks while everyone else decided to stay in the negotiations and conclude the agreement. We will see how many of them are there when the agreement starts, because we've signed the agreement. We now have the ratification and domestic level procedures taking place. The agreement will start or become active probably within this year, certainly. And it requires 6 out of 10 members of ASEAN and 3 out of the 5 dialogue partners, China, Japan, Korea, Australia, and New Zealand. I do not think all 15 will be there at the same time for a variety of reasons: domestic ratification challenges, competitiveness issues, domestic turmoil in some of our markets. So I think it'll be interesting to see. But the short answer to this long answer I'm giving you is this competitiveness challenge is common across everyone, but only India chose to exit at this time rather than continue forward with the agreement.
Yep, fantastic. And I think one of the points you raised there about, the different people sitting next to each other, this is the first time that we've seen China, Japan, and South Korea come together in one trade agreement, which I think in and of itself is pretty historic. Whether or not they are actually there, like you said, when ratification happens is quite another matter. But this certainly does kind of cement the primacy of the Asia Pacific region in global trade, if indeed its primacy needed to be cemented. Does India stepping away from the RCEP agreement, does that kind of put India at risk of missing out on influencing the shape of trade for the region? I think probably, Deborah, I'll start with you and we'll go around.
Absolutely. If the solution to competitiveness is to get out, I would say to people who are watching this, have you ever seen someone get more competitive in, let's say, a sporting event? You're better at cricket from not playing in the game and sitting on the sidelines than being involved in the competition. I think I have a hard time imagining how you become more competitive when you are not in the game. But that's the argument that India has been making, and that eventually domestically we will have more competitiveness develop, and at that point India can re-engage. But for me, you have to remember that not everyone else is also sitting out. They are practicing and they're engaging in the to use my analogy, cricket matches all the time. And so by the time India says, okay, now we're ready, we're going to come back in, I think it may have been too late, to be honest, because we will have had lots of experience, lots of practice, and crucially, lots of linkages that are happening between the members that India is not part of and will not be part of for some period of time. And for me, that's a loss. That's a loss for India. It's a loss for RCEP.
Rajiv, do you have anything to add on that?
I think I would highlight that for India going forward, the Asia Pacific region is going to be an increasingly important market. And we see that for the whole world, that the importance of the Asia Pacific as a region is becoming more and more important in terms of its share of world GDP. That's been rising quite dramatically over the last 20 years. And according to our forecasts, the Asia Pacific region's importance will continue to grow. And therefore, it is a very important future growth market for Indian exports, and not having a seat at the table for this very important regional trade agreement I think puts India strategically at a disadvantage in setting the rules of the game going forward, as Deborah has very nicely explained. But that doesn't mean that India will not be a player in the region. It already has significant trade with many of the countries in the Asia Pacific, and including the RCEP members. And of course, what it will do is proceed bilaterally to try to develop its engagement with the Asia Pacific trade partners. In a similar way to what we saw the US doing when President Trump pulled out the US out of the TPP deal. Of course, the US is a key trade and investment partner for the Asia Pacific, and trade has continued, but the engagement has been more bilateral. It's a perhaps second best solution, but I think that is what India will refocus on now to try to move ahead with its bilateral relationships. And we can see some efforts underway for India to engage bilaterally on trade liberalization with some of the important partners in the region.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's a good point there, because one side is business and one side is sort of policies, right? And so these trade agreements. Manab, from your side, what is there? What's happening within Indian industry? What are they doing to get out there without having this sort of RCEP in place?
Okay, let me for a moment go back to what Deborah has very nicely articulated, giving that analogy cricket. Now, if I can extend that analogy, see, India hasn't really chosen to stop practicing cricket. Only thing is that India has chosen which partner, which country it will play with, which country at this moment it will not play with. Please recognize that India has never been averse to or opposed to the trade pacts, kind of trade deals, including mega trade deals. Given that negotiations, etc., in India, there have been several countries, it has been 15 plus countries or regions or economies, India has either concluded or initiated the free trade agreements. Now, what the government has objections against joining RCEP is the current format, is the current form and shape. That's it. Otherwise, it was not opposed to inherently about RCEP per se. Also, it has been conveyed to other signatories of RCEP that our Act East policy, that was the bedrock of India's economic engagement with our neighbors on this side. It will continue in full throttle, and its engagement with ASEAN countries and other FTA partners would continue, if not would be amplified further. So that is one position I would just like to highlight. But what you have asked me, how industry. See, industry has been vocal for engagement in terms of trade pacts, trade deals with countries that have got complementarities, which are complementary economy, and which has got our market access and other demands to attend to. If you would have seen the news reports, India has been sort of in different stages in finding out various versions, various formats of trade engagement, trade agreements, early harvest kind of schemes with USA, EU, with UK. And very recently, India has signed a comprehensive kind of agreement with Mauritius. So India is very much in the game. India is not just sitting on the fringes. India is not sitting on the sidelines, but certainly we have got our preferences correct. We cannot really play with those countries alone, which would like to have only market access, keeping in view that India's large markets, but will not really come in with reciprocal market access in their destinations, A, and B, which will not really have enough safeguards in place so that our vulnerable agriculture dependent populations or marginal industries, small and medium industries, they are not protected enough. Yeah, back to you.
Absolutely. I think that it's particularly fitting that we continue with this cricket analogy for as long as possible. I think it's fantastic. Now, I wanted to pick up on a point that you made there, Manab, which was about India sort of, having its own kind of partners. And if I look at the figures, India's export growth over recent years seems to remain a lot more westward facing than that of other countries in the region. So, in the last decade, the US and Europe's share in India's exports has increased from about 38% to 43%, while its exports to ASEAN, Japan, and South Korea have declined to 46% from 51% previously. So that does seem to back up the point that you're making there. And I think what's interesting is that I've seen recently some talk of India looking to revive talks on free trade agreements with both the EU and the US. So I wanted to get a feel from all of you, how likely will this be, given the fact that India hasn't signed a trade agreement since 2012? How likely will this be? What are the obstacles? What are the barriers?
My view is that it's going to be a hard road for India in its trade negotiations. We have seen a history of India's negotiations on important trade deals, and of course RCEP is one such example, but also in WTO negotiations that India does negotiate very hard on many issues, which it's of course absolutely entitled to do, to protect its own views of its self-interest. However, it does mean that the process of negotiations tends to be long and protracted. And we've seen that also playing out in its talks with the EU in the past and with other important trade partners. So I think although there is that strategic motivation to build a trade relationship with the EU, it's clearly a very, very important export market. I think it will be a hard road because both sides will negotiate on various key issues. For India, services is very important. It's a big exporter of services such as back office services and other services as well to markets like the US and the EU. So I think it will be a hard negotiation, but of course the fruits would be significant once they can eventually come to a deal. So I don't think we can expect anything to be fast. That's not what's going to happen, I think. And similarly with the US, I mean, both sides will play tough in the negotiations, but I think the goodwill is there for India in its negotiations with the EU and with the US to achieve outcomes. And so I think the intention is there to try to find resolution. And I think, the incoming Biden administration from the US point of view would also be, quite keen, I think, to move forward with its strategic relations with India, clearly in trade and investment, but also in other areas. So I think, both the US and the EU would have considerable interest in trying to find a deal with India. And so I think it'll be a long road, but I think it will offer a lot of potential for all of the players in this.
I think there was the point there about sort of the Biden administration as well, the sort of different stance, right, towards trade. And there is this kind of this trend that the Biden administration seems to be sort of moving itself toward, which is building this unified front of democracies, I suppose, against China. And it's the extent to which that kind of opens the door for India to revive its trade relationship with the US. What are the opportunities and challenges there? Deborah, do you have sort of any insight to share on that?
I think that Rajiv is right. This is going to be a very long process. when the US starts to negotiate a trade agreement, it has to ask for input from stakeholders of all different kinds about what is it that they're looking for to have included in a trade agreement. What are the obstacles that they need to have? And I think that the US Trade Representative's Office, which is essentially the US Trade Ministry, will be flooded with an amazing amount of documents illustrating challenges that the American companies have had accessing the Indian market. And so we can talk about the strategic importance of an Indo-Pacific strategy. We can talk about the reason that for political reasons, this is important. But when it comes to a trade deal, it's also about business imperatives. And there will be a tremendous amount of interest from American companies, many of whom are struggling in India with an opaque, challenging, difficult regulatory landscape, especially aimed at American companies and American tech companies in particular, that is going to prove challenging if the US were to move ahead with full-scale discussions. So I suspect that even launching an FTA talk, which in the US would be difficult for domestic reasons, outside, no matter who the party is, to do so with India, I think is an added challenge. It's not to say it's not worth doing, because again, you wouldn't have all of the stakeholder interest in lots of these challenges that could be addressed in an FTA. So there's a lot of reasons to do so, political, strategic, and certainly economic issues, business concerns. But I just think it will be hard. It will be very hard to get going. It will be very challenging to negotiate, and it would be a monumental task to get it concluded and across the line in Congress, or for the European side, through the European Parliament and then the European member states. I think the Europeans have not quite the same domestic concerns about European companies operating in India, because they're in different sectors, but they still have a long list themselves of challenges operating in the Indian market that would have to be addressed. The Europeans come in, as the Biden administration, Americans will, with particular concerns around labor rights and human rights and environmental concerns, which it's not to say that it can't be addressed. It's just, it's another thing that gets added to the agenda that makes it often more challenging to finish. So I suspect that there are always tons of good reasons to do it. It is not going to be an easy lift.
If I could jump in there, just to, I absolutely agree with everything Deborah's just said. But I think the timing is really, really good now for the US and India to move forward. Last year, we saw, despite the pandemic, a phenomenal amount of new investment commitments by US tech companies to invest into India. Companies like Google, Facebook, Amazon, investing many billions of dollars. It was actually a huge surge at a time when, the pandemic could have been a negative factor for investment. So I think, that huge interest from US multinationals in India, I think probably makes it a very good time for the US and India to get together and move ahead, particularly with the new Biden administration also, coming in and, having an opportunity to show its credentials in terms of developing trade with the Asia Pacific, because actually India and the US are the two countries amongst the big players that are in a similar position. Neither of them are members of these Asia Pacific regional free trade agreements. They're neither a member of CPTPP nor of RCEP. So bilateral deals are the way forward. And I think that makes it particularly appropriate for the US and India to sit together and at least start that dialogue.
Absolutely, absolutely. Manab, is there anything that you'd like to add into that? I think that Deborah and Rajiv have covered off quite a few points there. Do you have anything that you'd like to include?
Yeah, in brief, very brief, because I think I agree with most of the stuff Rajiv and Deborah have said. So yes, first to take up that India-US route, that is going to be exceedingly difficult, complete agreement, because of historical reasons, because of the negotiating process, stakeholders consultation, everything. But as Rajiv said, the time is opportune. Probably we can make an impact by taking that opportunity, A, and B. Although it is not my view, but I've seen some experts have suggested not for the full-fledged, all-round FTA or comprehensive agreement, but even some agreement with partial scope. If that gives us a little more flexibility, little more time gain, and we can probably quickly stitch a mutually beneficial agreement, even if it doesn't qualify as a full-fledged or comprehensive kind of agreement. There's no harm. We can certainly go ahead with that, so far as or as long as that really satisfies both the countries, policymakers, business, trade, and other stakeholders. So that could be one way. Only one point to Rajiv, since I think we have been encouraged to exchange notes even among the panelists. So Rajiv, yes, you are right. India, over the years, India has earned that either reputation or ill reputation of being a hard negotiator at the WTO. Absolutely correct. But Rajiv, if you have seen last couple of years, there are countries, there are member countries, there are major countries who have not negotiated at all. Forget about hard. They have just ducked the negotiation.
I think that the point about the possibility of having an early deal, perhaps with a more limited scope, is a very, very interesting idea. I think that could be a good way forward to have a partial deal that doesn't cover everything, because I do think that these modern trade deals, the sort of state-of-the-art deals like CPTPP, have very wide-ranging chapters. And I think that makes it very difficult for these modern style trade deals to be quickly concluded. However, if both parties are willing to do something to get the ball rolling that's more limited in nature with the intent of adding further chapters in future, I think that's a very intriguing possibility. But of course, both sides have to be willing to go forward with that, and that remains uncertain of whether the US would be willing to give way on that area, because they have been quite keen in recent years to include a lot of new areas in their bilateral trade deals. And so if it can be done, then of course that may be a good way to get early wins on the bilateral trade between the US and India. And of course with the EU as well, but I think with the EU it may be more difficult. They have a template that they've been using for developing trade deals in Asia. They've had a number of very important trade deals in recent years bilaterally with Japan, with Vietnam. And so, I think that they perhaps would want to follow that kind of approach. But also from India's point of view, it's very important to get these deals in place, or at least the negotiations underway with such important trade partners. As you mentioned earlier in your comments, India's trade relationship globally is very much oriented towards the US and EU, unlike many other countries in Asia Pacific, which have been leaning more and more towards China. And so that was actually an advantage for India last year when there was that border conflict with China, and that created a new ice age in bilateral trade relations between China and India, as one might expect. But it meant that India wasn't quite as vulnerable as some of the other countries in the region to that kind of scenario. And because its focus has been on other big markets worldwide.
Yeah, absolutely. There was just a bit that I wanted to bat over to Deborah, because Manab, you mentioned sort of this kind of almost a piecemeal approach to trade liberalization, right? Sort of, we'll do an agreement with just one sector. And I think that kind of circles us back to Deborah's original comment, which is that, if everybody else is doing these big trade deals, we're not sort of getting out there and playing cricket. I don't know, Deborah, is that the right take on this?
Well, I think there are a number of challenges around doing these smaller agreements or sector-specific agreements, not the least of which is they're illegal. At least they have been, let me rephrase that, in the past. you had to include substantially all trade if you wanted to do a preferential arrangement under the World Trade Organization. So that was the rule. That rule has been, the WTO itself has been bent and battered. And there have been a number of countries, not the least of which is the US under Donald Trump, that battered it even further. And that started us down this path of having non-comprehensive, not substantially all trade included. The US-China phase 1 deal was supposed to be the beginning of something, but if it never leads anywhere, then it's a very small agreement that does not cover substantially all trade. And I think that's an issue. So how do we manage these relationships in a way that is not a trade agreement, but doesn't violate WTO rules? I think that's a tough challenge to solve. And while I'm on the topic of the WTO, let me just say that another challenge for getting negotiations underway or moving ahead quickly with the Europeans and the Americans is India's current stance in the WTO, where literally they just said, we are not interested in seeing the WTO move ahead unless it is all of us. So all 164 nations have to come together in order for the WTO to move ahead. Since that is not going to happen, it ties up the WTO forever. And that is a position that India and South Africa have taken that is opposite what the EU and the likely US want to see. And so that's like one additional layer of complexity in getting a trade agreement or negotiations over trade on the table with these two markets. So India's policy decisions around global trade also affects their policy decisions in bilateral negotiations.
Absolutely. Now, in the interest of time, I think we will sort of go to the last point here, which was, when the RCEP deal was signed, the signatories were really keen to leave the door open for India. They said in a statement that they reiterated that the RCEP remains open to India and sort of, made a call for it to come back to the table. I think that, it's quite clear that at the moment, the political will doesn't exist to join RCEP at the moment. But, do we expect to see this change? Is RCEP really in India's best interests? What's the outlook for India and RCEP? Manab, would you like to start us off?
Okay, this is, I speak again, I'm reiterating that in my personal capacity, it doesn't reflect anyone else's position. See, as I said earlier, India is not opposed to RCEP per se. We recognize RCEP is a mega trade deal. Only thing, Indian industry felt that it would be wise to stay out of it in the context of its current format, and because many of the concerns, many of the issues, so-called outstanding issues, have not been resolved till that point of time when India did make that exit. Now, if RCEP going forward, if those concerns are addressed, and if we get a correct positive signal that yes, the other members are willing, completely willing to plug those in, whatever some of them I have highlighted in my opening remarks. And also, we can see that it's an inclusive process. India will not be asked to make any extra down payment because it's joining late. And if India's concerns are addressed, why not? At least as an individual, in my individual personal capacity, I would certainly tend to think that it would be worthwhile to join RCEP in that revised format that would take care of India's concerns.
Okay, and Deborah, you look a little skeptical. What's your take on this?
I think that these countries bent over backwards to be accommodating to India. And if I look at the three issues that are on the table around rules of origin and tariff differentials, I would say, first of all, it's unlikely to happen. Second of all, because of India, frankly, we have a wretched section on tariff differentials still in the agreement. So India's out, we still have to deal with this mess. If you're a company, blah, what a nightmare. On services opening, the services openings in RCEP are actually quite powerful and they're quite significant. And the only part of this that India was concerned about is the tiniest one subsector of 160 subsectors. The rest of them, I think, are open. And even that one, I think, is quite good. So I think India got a lot of services opening. And on safeguards, there is a safeguards mechanism in there. It would not, of course, India is going to have more imports. It already imports. It's going to import more. As the region builds its supply chains, those imports are going to get even more competitive. So, you know, you're always going to face competition. I don't see how the RCEP members will address those issues any more thoroughly than they already have. I would say they've already done everything that they can, and India still wasn't satisfied. So the odds of them doing something now to get India back in the near term is got to be near zero. Got to be near zero. Again, I think it's a missed opportunity for everyone. It would have been much better for India to be in. It would have been much better for RCEP to have India, but it is not likely to happen in the near term.
Exactly. So then, Rajiv, just to finish us off here, what then is the way forward, in your view, for engagement between India, ASEAN, other RCEP partners?
I think given the geopolitical landscape in the Asia Pacific, at the moment, the road forward for India in the near to medium term is going to be bilateral engagement with key partners. And I think when we look at the Asia Pacific, there's a lot of political goodwill towards Japan, towards South Korea, towards Australia, New Zealand. So I think those relationships are going to be important. I think particularly Australia at the moment is engaging very strongly with India. So I can see a lot of potential for those relationships in trade and investment to build up. Within ASEAN also, you know, India has very much shifted its focus towards strengthening its trade and investment engagement with ASEAN. So I do think that there also we're going to see, you know, significant efforts by India to build its relationship. So I think India is very committed to the Asia Pacific. It's strategically more and more important for India. And I think we'll see, you know, that engagement happening, but very much on a bilateral basis.
Fantastic. Well, thank you to all of our panelists for joining us today. I think the title of this session was very fitting. I think India is both going its own way and changing its tune. And it will be interesting to see what comes next when it comes to trade for India. So thank you to our panelists for joining us today. And thank you as well for listening in to our audience.